She built her father's empire from a wheelchair, fought for every boardroom inch with bloodied hands, and believed she knew exactly what he left behind. She was wrong. The man refinishing furniture in a forgotten corner of her estate wasn't just a contractor. He was the secret her father spent 30 years burying, and the one person who could take everything from her without asking for a single thing. What happens when the truth your father died protecting turns out to be a person still living 2 miles from his grave? If this story grips you, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and follow until the very last word. Let me see how far this one travels. The morning Nathan Cole backed his truck through the iron service gate of the Hart estate. He was 40 minutes late and had dried paint on his left ear that he hadn't noticed yet. His daughter Lucy had spilled orange juice on his work shirt at breakfast, which meant he'd had to change, which meant he'd been running behind since 7:14 a.m., which was not how he liked to start a job. He liked to arrive early. He liked to walk a space before anyone was watching, to understand what kind of silence lived in it. Old houses had different kinds of silence. Some were peaceful. Some felt like they were holding their breath. The Hart estate, from what Nathan could see through the windshield as he pulled up the gravel service road, felt like the second kind. It was a large property, not obscene, not the kind of thing you'd see in a movie about a villain, but substantial. The main house was a 3-story federal-style structure with dark brick and tall windows, set back from the road behind a row of old oaks that had probably been there before anyone alive had been born. The grounds were kept. The hedges were trimmed. But there was something about the place that felt like maintenance rather than love. The kind of upkeep that says, we are keeping this intact rather than we are glad to live here. Nathan parked near the rear entrance as he'd been instructed, cut the engine, and sat for a moment. He did this at the start of every job. Not for any mystical reason, just to collect himself. He was 32. He ran a one-man restoration operation called Cole and Craft out of a converted garage on the edge of Dunmore, a mid-sized city in Pennsylvania that had once been something and was now working on figuring out what to become next. He did antiques, mostly. Furniture restoration, object cataloging, the occasional estate appraisal for probate lawyers who needed someone who knew what they were looking at. He was good at it. Not famous, not rich, but good. And that had been enough to keep the lights on and Lucy in school clothes that fit. He got out of the truck and grabbed his canvas tool bag from the passenger seat. The woman who met him at the service door was a household manager named Sylvia, 60-something, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the exhausted competence of someone who had been managing crises since before Nathan learned to walk. She shook his hand without warmth and led him inside. "The library is on the second floor," she said, walking ahead of him through a corridor that smelled of old wood and lemon polish. Mr. Hart's private collection, books, objects, correspondence materials, roughly 400 items, possibly more. The family wants a full catalog with condition assessments. You'll have full access to the room. The rest of the house is off limits unless Ms. Hart authorizes otherwise. "Understood," Nathan said. "Is there a deadline?" Ms. Hart would like a preliminary inventory within the first 2 weeks, full catalog within 6. Sylvia paused at the foot of a back staircase. "She's particular about how things are handled. If you have questions about the collection, you bring them to me first." "And if I have questions Ms. Hart needs to answer herself?" Sylvia looked at him in a way that made clear she considered this unlikely. "I'll let her know." She left him at the library door with a key card, a printed access code for the service elevator, and a reminder that lunch was not provided. The library was not what Nathan expected. He'd been in estate libraries before, the performative kind, where someone's grandfather had bought books by the yard because he liked how they looked on shelves, and the spines had never been cracked. This wasn't that. The shelves here were floor to ceiling, and they were the shelves of someone who actually read. The books were arranged by subject, not by color. Some had paper slips tucked between pages. Some were doubled up where the shelf had run out of room. There were notebooks stacked on one table, a brass magnifying glass on another, and in the corner, a wing-backed reading chair with a worn patch on the left armrest, exactly where a person's elbow would rest. Nathan stood in the doorway for a moment. He'd been hired to catalog this room. And he would. But first he took 2 slow minutes to understand what he was walking into. This was a room where someone had actually thought, where they'd sat alone and read, and worked something out. The air in it was different from the rest of the house, more settled somehow, less like held breath. He set his bag on the work table, pulled out his assessment forms and his digital recorder, and got to work. He spent the first 3 days doing nothing but initial documentation, shelf by shelf, object by object, working through the room methodically from west wall to east. Most of what he found was what he expected: a significant collection of American historical texts, a set of first edition business memoirs from the early 20th century, framed correspondence on the walls that looked personal rather than decorative. Robert Hart, the late founder of Heartstone Capital, had clearly been a man who took his reading seriously. The books were real. The annotations in the margins were real. The man had apparently argued with historians in pen. Nathan found himself reading the marginal notes more than he should have. He had a professional habit of cataloging objects without getting drawn into their histories. You had to, otherwise you'd spend 3 days on one desk. But the notes were hard to ignore. They weren't the notes of a man performing intelligence. They were the notes of a man genuinely working through things, questioning, revising, sometimes just writing no in emphatic capital letters, next to a claim he apparently found unconvincing. On Thursday of the first week, Nathan found the desk. It was against the east wall, half hidden behind a floor lamp and a wooden filing cabinet that had clearly been pushed in front of it at some point and never moved back. It was a roll-top secretary desk, American, late 19th century, walnut with brass hardware, and it was in rough shape. The tambour was partially jammed, one of the side cabinets had a broken hinge, and someone had water-damaged the writing surface at some point, leaving a pale ring stain near the front edge. Nathan moved the filing cabinet out of the way and crouched down to examine the desk. It was his first instinct to note the damage and move on. The catalog wasn't about restoration, just condition assessment. But the jammed tambour bothered him. He pressed his palm against it gently, testing. The mechanism had seized up from humidity and age, but the way it was resisting suggested something was pressing against it from inside. He went to his bag and got a thin wooden shim and worked it carefully into the right-hand track. The timbre groaned, then gave, rolling back in an uneven, stiff motion. The interior of the desk was mostly empty. A dried-out inkwell, some loose paper clips, a cracked leather pen holder. But in the small center compartment, behind a decorative panel that had once been decorative and was now also stuck, Nathan found the box. It was wooden, about the size of a hardback novel, made from what looked like cherry wood, with a simple latch mechanism and no lock. It was not remarkable on its own. It was the kind of box that got made in the 19th century as a gentleman's keepsake, the sort Nathan had cataloged a dozen of. But it was tucked so far back in the compartment that he had to remove the panel completely to reach it, and when he lifted it out, he could feel from the weight and the sound of things shifting inside that it contained more than a folded note. He set it on the work table and stood back for a moment. He should document it unopened. Photograph it in situ first, note the location, the condition, the discovery date. That was procedure. He got his camera and did all of that, methodically, step by step. Then he opened it. Inside were 3 objects: a folded photograph, a sealed envelope with no name on it, and a single index card on which something had been written in fountain pen. The ink was dark blue, slightly faded. The handwriting was deliberate and careful. Nathan read the card first. "My greatest riddle is not a question. It is a person." He read it twice. He didn't know what it meant. He set it aside and looked at the photograph. It was a Polaroid. Older, the color slightly washed, the border yellowed. It showed 2 people, a man in his mid-30s, well-dressed but not formally so, and a young woman, maybe 20, with dark eyes and a wide smile that looked like it had surprised her. They were standing outside somewhere Nathan didn't recognize. The man had his arm around the woman's shoulders. They looked easy together, natural, not posed. Nathan turned the Polaroid over. On the back, in the same careful fountain pen handwriting, Margaret, 1989. He looked at the sealed envelope for a long moment. His job was to catalog, not to open personal correspondence. Whatever was in that envelope belonged to the estate, and the estate had a legal representative, and his name was not on it. He photographed the envelope and set everything back in the box. Then he carried the box downstairs to find Sylvia. He found her in the kitchen with a phone to her ear and a look on her face that said whatever conversation she was having was the 15th unwanted one of the day. She held up a finger, finished her call, and turned to face him. "Found something," Nathan said. He set the box on the kitchen table between them. In the secretary desk on the east wall, behind a jammed tambour, there's a note, a photograph, and a sealed envelope. Sylvia looked at the box, then at him. "Did you open the envelope?" "No." She seemed to take that in. "Leave it with me. I'll let Miss Hart know." "The note's worth flagging," Nathan said. "It's unusual." Sylvia looked at the index card without touching it, reading the words. Something passed across her face, not quite surprise, not quite recognition, but she kept her expression in control. "I'll handle it." Nathan nodded and went back upstairs. He didn't think about the box for the rest of that day. He had work to do. 30-odd books still to document on the south shelf, 2 small bronzes on the mantel that needed condition photographs, a stack of framed documents that turned out to be original stock certificates from companies that no longer existed. He thought about Lucy instead, which was where his mind went when it wasn't occupied. He was picking her up at 4 from her after-school program. She had a science project due next week on weather patterns, which she had not started and which she had promised him twice she would start. He needed to pick up more oatmeal. He was out of the good coffee. This was the texture of his daily mental life, and he found it stabilizing rather than small. Some people needed large thoughts to feel grounded. Nathan needed small ones, the concrete, manageable facts of a life that he could actually affect. He'd built his life around that principle, deliberately, after Lucy's mother left when Lucy was 2. There had been a period after that, about 18 months, when Nathan had not been particularly together. He wasn't proud of it. He'd managed, he'd kept working, kept Lucy fed and cared for, but he'd also been angry in a way he didn't know how to put down, and the anger had made him brittle in ways that cost him. A few friendships, a contract or 2 he'd handled badly. He'd gotten help eventually. Not gracefully, not without resistance. And then he'd gotten better, slowly, in the specific unglamorous way that people actually got better, which involved a lot of small decisions made correctly over time. He was better now. Not fixed. Better. He picked Lucy up at 4. She had oatmeal on her jacket somehow, which she could not explain, and she had not started her weather project, which she explained very thoroughly with a logic Nathan could not entirely fault. "I was going to start it," she said in the car on the way home, "but then Mia wanted to show me this thing she found. Lucy. It was a really interesting thing. The project is due Friday." "I know. It's Thursday tomorrow." "Dad." She gave him a patient look. She had gotten Robert's patience already, which was to say, the patience of someone who has decided that explaining yourself is worth the effort, but only once. "I know when Thursday is. I'm 9, not 5. "When are you starting the project?" "Tonight, after dinner." "That's what you said yesterday." "Yesterday I meant it less." Nathan looked at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window with the particular expression she got when she was trying not to smile. He loved her with the specific, complicated, sometimes exhausting intensity that he imagined was particular to parents who had spent significant time as the only parent, a love that was partly fierce and partly terrified, and partly just grateful. "After dinner," he said. "After dinner," she confirmed. They stopped for oatmeal on the way home. Awesome. The next morning, Nathan arrived at the Hart estate and found a different kind of silence. Sylvia was waiting for him at the service door, not the waiting because she had something to tell him kind, the waiting because she was told to kind. Behind her, through the interior door, Nathan could see a younger woman he hadn't seen before, seated at the kitchen table, both hands flat on the surface. He paused on the threshold. The woman was in a wheelchair. She was around his age, he thought, maybe slightly younger, with dark eyes and a quality of stillness that was not the same thing as calm. She was in professional clothes, dark slacks, a structured gray blazer, and her hair was pulled back in a way that might have been hurried or might have been deliberate. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize, not hostile, not welcoming, assessing. On the table in front of her was the box Nathan had found the day before. Mr. Cole, Sylvia said. Miss Hart would like a word. Nathan stepped inside. Evelyn Hart looked at him for a moment without speaking, which he found he didn't mind. He wasn't easily unnerved by silences. He worked alone most of the time. Silence was professional. You found this yesterday, she said. Not a question. Yes. Where exactly? Secretary desk, east wall, behind the floor lamp. The tambour was seized up. Something was pressing against it from inside. I worked it loose during a standard examination. She looked back at the box. You didn't open the envelope? No. She looked up at him again. Why not? Wasn't addressed to me. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not warmth exactly, more like a recalibration. Sit down, she said. He sat. I've been running this company for 8 months, Evelyn said. My father died last January. Cardiac event, unexpected. He was 67. He was supposed to have more time. She said it flatly, the way people said things they had worked very hard to be able to say flatly. He left me the company, the estate, and about 400 things I have to make decisions about every week, most of which I'm not qualified to make. I'm doing it anyway because someone has to. Nathan said nothing. It didn't feel like the kind of statement that needed a response. It felt like something she was telling him because she needed to tell someone, and he happened to be there. The box, she said. The note. The photograph. She pulled the index card from the box and set it on the table between them. My greatest riddle is not a question. It is a person. You know whose handwriting this is? No. My father's. She looked at the card for a long moment. He left notes sometimes, in books, on pieces of paper tucked in drawers. It's how he thought. He believed in writing things down. She paused. I opened the envelope this morning. She did not say what was in it. Nathan did not ask. I'm going to need you to continue the catalog, she said. But I'm also going to need you to take your time with that desk in particular. Document everything, every drawer, every compartment. If you find anything else, anything at all, no matter how small, you bring it directly to me, not to Sylvia, not to anyone else. Me. Understood. And Mr. Cole? She stopped. Something moved across her face that she controlled quickly. What made you curious about that tambour? You could have noted it as damaged and moved on. Nathan considered the question. It was a real one. The resistance felt wrong, he said. Normal seized tambour has a particular feel. This was pushing back differently. I wanted to know why. She looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said quietly. That will be all. The following week was a strange one. Nathan worked in the library every morning, methodical and careful. He'd taken Evelyn's instructions seriously. He was documenting the secretary desk with a thoroughness that went beyond the job's original scope, photographing every interior angle, measuring every compartment. He found 2 more items. A dried flower pressed between sheets of wax paper with no identification attached, and a small leather journal with a broken clasp that turned out to be entirely empty inside. He brought both directly to Evelyn's attention, as instructed. She appeared both times in the library doorway within 20 minutes of being told, examined both items, and left without extensive comment. She had a quality of absorbing information without reacting to it immediately, something that probably served her well in boardrooms and served her less well, Nathan suspected, in most human situations. He began to notice her presence in the house more than he would have expected. Not that she was hovering. She wasn't. But the estate was her home as well as her office, and she worked odd hours, and sometimes Nathan would hear the sound of a wheelchair on the hardwood corridor outside the library, or see her through the doorway moving between rooms with the phone held flat against her shoulder, talking in the focused monotone of someone who had been in a meeting too long and was still in it mentally. He registered her without thinking about her particularly. That wasn't unkindness. It was professionalism. He was hired to do a job, and the job had specific parameters. On Wednesday of that week, he was eating his packed lunch on the back stairs, a small breach of decorum he allowed himself, when she appeared at the bottom of the staircase in her chair. She didn't seem surprised to see him there. She didn't seem like a woman who was easily surprised by anything. The yellow stain on the writing surface, she said. Is it repairable? He swallowed his sandwich. Yes, it's a water ring. Relatively shallow penetration. I do a mild oxalic treatment, then refinish the affected area. My father used that desk when he was young, before he built the company. He brought it with him when he moved from... She stopped. It was important to him. Nathan nodded. She looked at the staircase beside him, apparently not bothered by the fact that she couldn't use it. What's your professional read on the collection? Overall. Significant, he said honestly. Not just monetarily, the personal material, the correspondence, the annotation work in the books. It's a real picture of how someone thought, the kind of thing an archive would want. He wasn't trying to create an archive. I know, that's usually when the best ones get made. She looked at him again with that quality of assessment that he was getting used to. How did you get into this work? The question caught him slightly off guard. Most clients didn't ask. My uncle had a furniture repair shop. I worked there summers when I was a kid. Figured out I liked old things. Liked the problem solving of it. He paused. And I'm bad at offices. Something that wasn't quite a smile crossed her face. I spend most of my life in one. Yeah, he said. I can tell. She looked at him, and he thought for a moment he'd overstepped. But then she made a sound that was close enough to a laugh that it seemed to count. Finish your lunch, Mr. Cole, she said. She turned her chair and went back inside. He didn't tell Lucy about the estate in any detail. He mentioned it in the way he mentioned all his jobs. I'm working on a catalog for a private collection, big house, a lot of books, without the particulars that belong to the client's privacy. But Lucy, who was 9 and therefore constructed almost entirely of questions, had noticed he was thinking about something. You keep doing the face, she said on Saturday morning, watching him over her cereal. What face? The face where you are somewhere else. She pointed at him with her spoon. You do it when a job has a puzzle in it. Nathan looked at her. She was not wrong. I found something interesting at work, he said. What kind of interesting? The kind where someone hid something on purpose, but also maybe wanted it to be found eventually. Lucy considered this with the gravity she gave to most things. Like a time capsule. Maybe. A little. Who hid it? The man who owned the house. He died 8 months ago. Lucy chewed her cereal. Do you think he wanted his daughter to find it? Nathan hadn't thought about it quite that way. Why do you ask that? Because if he wanted a stranger to find it, he'd have put it somewhere easier. But it was hidden really well, right? So either he forgot about it, or he wanted someone specific to find it. Or... She stopped. Or he was waiting to tell the person himself and he ran out of time. Nathan looked at his daughter. That's a good thought, he said. I know, she said, and went back to her cereal. He was back in the library on Monday when Evelyn came in and closed the door behind her. That was new. She'd always left it open before. She didn't sit. She positioned her chair near the window and looked out at the garden for a moment before speaking. Her hands were in her lap, and she was doing something with them. Not fidgeting, exactly, but a controlled tension, the way someone's hands look when the rest of them is working hard to appear composed. I've had the envelope reviewed, she said, by my legal team and by a private document examiner. Nathan waited. The contents are... She stopped. Started again. My father had a relationship before he met my mother. In the late 1980s, a woman named Margaret Calloway. She looked at the garden. She had a son in 1992. Nathan said nothing. The letter in the envelope is from my father, Evelyn said. Handwritten, 1993. It's addressed to the son, who would have been about 1 year old at the time. She paused. He never sent it. The room was very quiet. Why are you telling me this? Nathan asked. His voice was level. He didn't know why he needed it to be level. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. Because I think you may already know part of the answer, Mr. Cole. And I think my father put that box in that desk because he intended, eventually, for someone to look. She paused. And I think the reason he hired a restoration specialist 8 months after his death, in his will, specifically, it was in his will, is that he knew a restoration specialist would look harder than most people would. Nathan felt a stillness come over him that was different from the professional kind. My father's name is unknown to me, he said carefully. My mother, Margaret. She died when I was 6. Car accident. I was raised by her sister. Evelyn held his gaze without looking away. Margaret Calloway, she said. The clock on the mantel ticked. Nathan became aware that his hands were flat on the work table, which he didn't remember doing. He became aware that the room seemed slightly larger and slightly smaller at the same time, which made no physical sense. He became aware that somewhere in this house there was an unsent letter written to a 1-year-old boy, and that the boy had grown up not knowing who his father was, and that the boy's name was Nathan. I need some air, he said. Evelyn nodded. Take your time, she said quietly. He stood and walked to the door, and then he stood in the hallway for a long time, not going anywhere, just breathing. The hallway was dim and smelled of lemon polish and old wood, and the silence in it was the second kind, the held breath kind. But for the first time since he'd walked into this house, it didn't feel hostile. It felt like something waiting to exhale. He sat on the back stairs again, the same stairs where he'd eaten his lunch last Wednesday, where Evelyn had asked him what he'd found interesting about the collection, and he'd said the kind of thing an archive would want. He sat there for 20 minutes. He thought about his mother. He hadn't done that in a while, not the specific memory kind of thinking, just the general ache of it, which had softened over the years into something he carried without noticing most of the time. He thought about growing up in his Aunt Carol's house, which had been a good house, a real one, with its own warmth and its own complications, and how Carol had told him his father had not been in the picture, which was true, and how she had never told him anything else, which now he understood was not the whole truth. He thought about Lucy. He thought about the face she'd made on Saturday, the 9-year-old philosopher face, when she'd said or he was waiting to tell the person himself and he ran out of time. He thought about a man sitting alone in this library, in a wing-back chair with a worn patch on the left armrest, writing a letter he never sent. He didn't feel anything in particular, not joy, not grief, not the clean dramatic catharsis that stories suggested you were supposed to feel in a moment like this. He felt something more like the particular sensation of a jammed tambour giving way, a resistance releasing all at once, leaving behind a hollow space that would take time to understand. He went back inside. Evelyn was still in the library when he returned. She had turned her chair back to the room and was looking at the shelves of her father's books with an expression he recognized now. It was the same expression he'd seen the first day. Maintenance, not love. Except it wasn't quite that anymore. It was something more complicated. The face of a person looking at something they've had to fight for and wondering, for the first time, whether the fight was the whole story. Tell me about the letter, he said. She looked at him. She reached into the pocket of her blazer and held it out. He looked at it for a moment, an envelope, cream-colored, worn at the corners with age, no name on it. And then he took it, and he sat down in the wing-back chair with the worn patch on the armrest, and he opened it, and he read what his father had written to him 30 years ago in a room that still felt, somehow, like him. The light through the library windows was the long gold of late afternoon, and neither of them spoke for a very long time. The letter was 4 pages long, not typed, not dictated, written by hand on the kind of heavy cream paper that suggested the writer had sat down knowing this was important, had chosen the paper deliberately, had wanted the weight of the thing to mean something even if no one ever read it. Nathan read it twice in the library chair while the afternoon light moved across the floor. He didn't cry. He wasn't sure what he felt was connected to crying. It was something more like the sensation of a room you'd lived in for years suddenly revealing a wall that had always been there but that you'd never been able to see. Robert Hart had written to a boy who was 1 year old and would never read it. He had written anyway. The letter began without preamble. I don't know how to start this, so I won't try to be clever about it, and proceeded in the same direct, slightly stubborn handwriting Nathan had been reading in book margins for 2 weeks. Robert Hart had written about Margaret, about meeting her in 1988 at a conference in Philadelphia where he had been presenting quarterly projections to a room of people he did not respect, and she had been there as a junior accountant for a partner firm, and she had asked him afterward, in the hallway, whether he actually believed half of what he'd just said. He'd been annoyed. Then he'd been surprised. Then he'd been in love. in the sideways, inconvenient way that he described as not what I was planning and not what the timing allowed. He had written about the year they were together, about how the company was already consuming him by then. Heartstone Capital was 3 years old and hemorrhaging pressure from every direction, investors circling, the board already calcifying into the thing it would become. He had written about Margaret getting pregnant, about his own failure to rise to that moment the way he should have, about the specific cowardice of a man who chose the thing he'd built over the person he loved. I told myself I would fix it later. That is the oldest lie men tell themselves, and I told it completely. He had written about finding out, years later, that Margaret had moved and had a son and was raising him alone. About trying to make contact and being told, through channels, always through channels, because that was the world he'd built for himself, that she didn't want it. About not pushing harder, which he listed without self-defense as one of the central failures of his life. And then he had written about the board chairman, Richard Hart, his own uncle. Richard knew about you from the beginning. He made it very clear, in the way Richard makes things clear, that acknowledging you would complicate the question of succession in ways the company could not survive. I believed him. That is also on me. I chose the company's stability over your existence, and I have spent every year since trying to decide what kind of man that makes me. Nathan set the letter down on his knee and looked at the ceiling. Richard Hart. He'd seen the name in news coverage he'd found online the evening before, after coming home from the estate and sitting in his truck in the driveway for longer than he planned. Richard Hart, chairman of the board of Heartstone Capital, 71 years old, the architect of the company's governance structure, and by most accounts, the second most powerful person in the organization. He picked the letter back up. If you are reading this, if someone finds this and finds you, or if you find it yourself, I want you to know that the silence was never indifference. I know that distinction may not matter to you. It may not be worth much. But I spent 30 years in a room that I chose over you, and I want you to know that I knew what I was choosing, and I knew what it cost. The letter ended without drama, no deathbed conversion, no sweeping declaration, just, your name, I was told, is Nathan. Your mother's name was Margaret Calloway, and she deserved better than I gave her. If you have questions, I hope there is still someone left to answer them. Nathan folded the letter carefully along its original creases. He looked at Evelyn. She had been very still through all of it, positioned near the window, giving him the room. She was good at that, giving space without disappearing from it. He'd noticed that about her. She didn't perform sensitivity. She just stopped taking up more room than was necessary and let things be what they were. Richard knew, he said. Yes. He concealed it. For 30 years, apparently. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, a tightness, that he recognized as the sound of someone who had processed very little of this. I've been going over what I know about the board governance documents, the succession protocols. If my father had a biological child, he acknowledged, legally, formally, it would have complicated everything Richard built. Complicated how? Inheritance structure, voting rights, the foundation of the ownership stake. She paused. Richard designed all of it. Every clause, every carve-out. He had 30 years to make sure the structure pointed only one direction. Nathan was quiet for a moment. I don't want the company, he said. She looked at him steadily. I know. I'm telling you because I want you to hear it as a fact, not as a negotiating position. I heard it the first time. She said it without hardness. That doesn't change what the documents may legally require. He turned the folded letter in his hands. Outside, the October light was going amber, the afternoon narrowing toward evening. He thought about the drive home, about Lucy's science project, about the particular ordinary mechanics of his evening that would continue regardless of what this room contained. That thought was oddly stabilizing. What's in the sealed records? He asked. Evelyn moved her chair slightly, which he'd learned was something she did when she was thinking. The envelope contained the letter and a photograph, different from the one you found. More recent. You from a distance. You were maybe 7 or 8. She held his gaze. He had someone watching out for you, not monitoring, not interfering, just knowing you were there. Nathan didn't say anything. There was also a notary's business card clipped to the inside of the envelope, she continued. A firm called Bassett and Holt. They're not in business anymore, but the original registered agent is still licensed. I had my assistant look it up this morning. What does that mean? It means there may be additional documentation, the kind that doesn't live in a box in a desk. She looked at her hands for a moment. The kind that gets filed and sealed and held. Nathan drove home slower than usual. He stopped at the light on Carver Street, which was always long, and sat through it even after it turned green because the car behind him hadn't honked yet, and he needed one more second. The person behind him was patient. He was grateful. He thought about his Aunt Carol. She lived in Harrisburg now, in a house she'd bought after her kids moved out, with a garden she spent too much time in and a cat named after a jazz musician. She was 71 and had bad knees and called him every Sunday without fail, even when he'd been bad about calling back, even through the 18 bad months after Lucy's mother left, even when he'd been the kind of person who didn't deserve consistent Sunday calls. She knew. He understood that now, with the quiet certainty of someone who had put things in order. She had always known who Margaret's son was. She had protected Nathan from it, or protected herself from the conversation, or protected some version of the past that was easier to carry than the full weight of it. Maybe all three. People rarely had clean reasons for keeping things from the people they loved. He drove the rest of the way home running through how he would ask her. Not whether he would. He was done with not asking. Lucy had finished the weather project. He found her at the kitchen table with colored pencils and 3 sheets of poster board laid end to end, creating what appeared to be the most extensively illustrated diagram of a cold front in the history of 4th grade science. "This is a lot," Nathan said. "I got into it," she said, without looking up. "Did you know that the word hurricane might come from a word meaning evil spirit in some indigenous languages?" "I did not know that." "I put it in the introduction. Ms. Ferraro might say it's off topic, but I think it adds texture." Nathan stood behind her and looked at the poster board. It was genuinely impressive, not in a children's art way, in an I have a daughter who commits fully to things way, which was something he found both exhausting and excellent about her. "It's good, Luce." She looked up then, and she looked at him the way she sometimes did, the direct, unguarded look that 9-year-olds had before they learned to protect themselves. And she said, "You found out something about the puzzle today, didn't you?" He sat down across from her. "Yeah," he said, "I did." "Is it a good something or a bad something?" He thought about that honestly. "I don't know yet. It's a big something, the kind where you need some time before you know which kind it is." She nodded, accepting this, and went back to her cold front. "Okay," she said. "You can tell me when you figure it out." He sat there for a little while, watching her color. He called Carol on Sunday as usual, and then, after the normal parts of the call, the garden, the cat, Lucy's school week, his work, he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." There was a pause on the line. The specific quality of it told him everything before she answered. "Nathan," she said. "Robert Hart," he said. "Was that my father?" Another pause. Longer. "Your mother asked me not to tell you," Carol said finally. Her voice had gone quiet in the way of someone who had been waiting for something for a long time and was not entirely relieved it had finally arrived. "She was afraid of what it would do to you, the wanting of it," she said. "She'd watched it do damage to people and she—" Carol stopped. "She was protecting you the way she thought was right. And after she died, I kept making the same choice she made, and I kept telling myself it was for your sake, and I don't know anymore if that was true." Nathan was sitting on the back porch. It was cold enough that he could see his breath. Above him, through the oak branches, the sky was the deep, specific blue of an October evening that had given up on warmth. "Did you know him?" he asked. "I met him once," Carol said, "after Margaret passed. He came to the service. He didn't say who he was. He sat in the back. He looked—" She paused. "He looked like a man who understood he hadn't earned the right to take up much space." Nathan let out a slow breath. "He reached out to me," Carol continued, "once through a lawyer, asked how you were. I told him you were fine. I didn't tell him anything else, and I told the lawyer not to contact me again." Her voice cracked slightly, then recovered. I don't know if that was right. I've thought about it a lot. I'm not angry at you, Nathan said. He meant it, which surprised him slightly. You might be later. Maybe. I'll let you know. She made a sound that was part laugh, part something else. You sound like her when you say things like that. He hadn't expected that to land the way it did. He sat with it for a moment, this small piece of his mother given back to him on a Sunday call he'd almost let go to voicemail. I'll come see you, he said. Soon. Bring Lucy, she said. She can tell me about the weather project. I heard it's ambitious. At the estate the following Tuesday, Evelyn was waiting for him in the library with someone Nathan didn't know. A woman in her late 40s, sharply dressed, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and a leather document portfolio in her lap. She introduced herself as Diane Walsh, senior counsel for the estate. They sat, Nathan in the wingback chair, Evelyn near the window, Diane across the table, and Diane laid out, methodically and without melodrama, what the document examiner had confirmed and what Diane's own research had begun to establish. The letter was authenticated. The handwriting was Robert Hart's beyond reasonable question. The photograph of Nathan as a child bore a date stamp and a handwritten notation on the back in Robert's hand, and Bassett and Holt, the notary firm mentioned on the card, had been absorbed by another firm in 2014, whose registered agent had confirmed when Diane called that they did hold sealed documents for a client named Robert Hart to be released only upon his death to a named party. The named party, Diane said, looking at Nathan, is identified in the sealing order as the biological son of Robert James Hart and Margaret Calloway. The documents have not yet been released because no one submitted a claim. Because no one knew to submit a claim, Evelyn said from the window. Correct. Nathan looked at the table. What are the documents? We don't know the full contents until the claim is submitted and processed, but based on the sealing order's registration, Bassett and Holt logged them as original birth record, personal correspondence, and a testamentary instrument. Diane paused. A will. The room held that word for a moment. There's a prior will, Evelyn said. She was looking out the window, not at Nathan, and her voice had the flat quality again, the processing without reacting quality. Before the one that named me sole heir. Almost certainly, Diane said. Richard would have known, Evelyn said. Yes. He would have structured the board governance to survive it, legally challenged any prior claim before it surfaced. She paused. He's been preparing for this for decades. Nathan looked at her. You sound certain. She turned from the window. I've been running a company that Richard Hart built the architecture of for 8 months, she said. I know how he thinks. He doesn't leave exposure sitting around. Everything is structured, layered, preemptive. A muscle in her jaw moved. The reason I could never quite understand why he was so invested in my appointment as CEO, when there were other candidates, better candidates by some metrics, people with more operational experience, is because I was the one piece of the succession he was sure he controlled. Nathan said nothing. He thought I was manageable, she said. It came out without self-pity, just the plain statement of a fact she'd clearly arrived at before today. He thought the wheelchair, the grief, the 8 months of chaos. He thought I'd be too occupied to ask the wrong questions. She looked at Nathan directly. He was right for a while, she said. I was. They submitted the claim to the registered agent that Friday. Diane handled the paperwork. Nathan signed where his name was required and wrote in careful block letters a version of his name he'd been writing his whole life without knowing what else it carried. The processing time was estimated at 2 to 3 weeks. In the meantime, Nathan kept working in the library. It was the right thing to do. The catalog still needed to be completed regardless of what any of this turned out to mean. And it was also, he acknowledged to himself, the only part of this situation he actually knew how to handle. He could not process 30 years of absence. He could not yet fully feel the specific grief of a father he never knew, who had made choices Nathan hadn't yet decided how to judge. He could not work out what any of this meant for Lucy, for his own name, for the ordinary life he'd built with deliberate care. But he could document a library. He could examine objects, note conditions, identify ages, understand how things were made. That was work he knew the shape of. Evelyn appeared in the library doorway on Thursday afternoon and leaned against the frame without coming in, which was different from her usual pattern. She was holding a mug of something and looked like she hadn't slept particularly well. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Do you remember anything about her? Your mother?" He kept working, his hands on the spine of a 1962 edition of something, but he answered. "Not much. She had red hair. She smelled like a specific kind of soap that I've never found again. She used to sing off-key in the kitchen." He paused. "She laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. Carol told me that." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "My father used to read aloud in here sometimes," she said. "Even when I was around. He'd just start reading something and expect you to sit and listen." She looked at the shelves. "I thought it was rude when I was a teenager. I'd give a lot for it now." Nathan set the book down. "He sounds like someone who thought his time was mostly his own to spend," he said. "That can be a hard quality to live with when you're young." "It was." "But you came back," he said. "You're here. 8 months of board meetings and a company you didn't ask to run." She looked at him. "He was still my father." "Yeah," Nathan said. "I know." The word father sat between them in the room that had been built around the absent weight of that one man, and neither of them felt the need to add anything to it. Richard Hart called Evelyn the following Monday. She told Nathan about it that afternoon, in the flat tone she used when she was most controlled. Richard had, apparently, caught wind of the document claim through the legal network, which was not surprising. Diane had warned them it was possible, and had called Evelyn's cell directly, which he had not done in 3 months. He had not mentioned Nathan by name. He had spoken about external parties attempting to create claims against the estate. He had reminded Evelyn of the board's unified governance protocols and the importance of stability. He had mentioned, more than once, the concept of loyalty. "What did you say?" Nathan asked. "I thanked him for calling," she said. "That's all?" "That's all." She set her mug on the windowsill. "I've been running a company where every word I say in a phone call becomes information. I don't give Richard information anymore." Nathan nodded. "He knows," she said. "He's known since before we submitted the claim, probably. He's been watching for exactly this. For 30 years, if my father's letter is accurate." Her expression was controlled, but her hands on the wheels of her chair were white at the knuckles. "He's not going to sit still." "I know," Nathan said. "He has the board. He has resources. He has people who have been in place for decades." "I know." "And you still don't want the company?" "No." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Then what do you want?" He thought about Lucy asking him the same question, in a different form, on a Saturday morning over cereal. He thought about his mother, who he barely remembered, and a man who had sat in this chair and written a letter he never sent. He thought about Robert Hart's margins, the careful, argumentative, deeply human no, written in emphatic letters next to ideas that deserved to be questioned. "I want it to be true," he said. "The documented, legal, irrefutable true. Not for the company. Not for money. For Lucy to know where she comes from. For my father's name to be part of her history instead of a blank." He paused. "And I want to know why Richard Hart thought he had the right to take 30 years from someone he'd never met." Evelyn was quiet for a long time. "Okay," she said, finally. She turned her chair toward the door, then stopped. "Nathan," she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He looked up. "Whatever Richard has prepared," she said, "he didn't prepare for someone who doesn't want what he thinks they want." She said it without drama, just the level statement of someone who had spent 8 months watching a man move pieces on a board and had finally identified the one piece he'd miscalculated. She left the room. Nathan sat in his father's chair for a moment, in the long afternoon silence of a library full of a dead man's thoughts, and turned that over. Outside, the October trees were losing their last hold on color. The wind moved through them with the cold indifference of a season that did not negotiate. Nathan watched through the window and let himself feel, for just a moment, the full strange weight of where he was. Not as a problem to be solved, not as a story to be processed, but as a fact to be carried forward, the way all real things eventually had to be. He had a job to finish. He had a daughter at home with a weather project already handed in and a new question forming, probably, even now. He had a father he would never meet and a history he was only starting to understand. He turned back to the catalog. There was still work to do. The sealed documents arrived on a Wednesday. Diane called Nathan at 7:48 in the morning while he was making Lucy's lunch and half listening to the weather report on the kitchen radio. He stepped outside onto the back porch into the cold and listened to her walk through it. The registered agent had released the full package to the estate's legal team the previous afternoon. Diane had spent the night reviewing. Her voice was carefully neutral in the way of a lawyer who had learned to deliver significant information without coloring it. The birth record listed Nathan James Cole, born March 4, 1992, mother Margaret Ann Calloway, father Robert James Hart. There was a notary seal dated March 1993, meaning Robert had legally documented the birth a year after the fact. The document had been sealed immediately upon filing, through a legal mechanism that Diane explained required the cooperation of a sitting judge and almost certainly significant money. The personal correspondence included 6 letters, Robert to Margaret, spanning 1992 to 1996. In them, he outlined a private financial arrangement, a trust Nathan had never known about, managed through a legal intermediary that had been funding a savings account in Nathan's name since 1993. The account, Diane told him, currently held just over $400,000. Nathan stood on his back porch in the cold and said nothing for a moment. "Nathan," Diane said, "I'm here." "There's also the will," she said. "It predates the one that named Evelyn sole heir by 6 years. It's properly executed, witnessed, notarized. In it, Robert Hart names you co-primary beneficiary alongside Evelyn, with majority voting interest in Heartstone Capital." The radio was still going inside the kitchen. Lucy had turned it up slightly, which meant she was dancing while she ate her cereal, which was something she did when she thought no one was watching. "Okay," Nathan said. "There will be a challenge," Diane said. "I want you to understand that this is not resolved by the existence of the documents. Richard Hart's people will contest. Hard. I know. I want you to be prepared." "Diane," he said, "I've been a single father for 7 years. I know how to be prepared for a fight I didn't start." A pause. "Fair enough," she said. "I'll be in touch." He went back inside. Lucy had finished her cereal and was doing exactly what he thought, a small, self-contained dance near the counter while pretending to look for her backpack. "I know you see me," she said, without turning around. "I didn't say anything." "You were going to." "I was going to say your lunch is on the counter." She grabbed it. Then she looked at him with the particular directness she deployed when she'd decided a conversation was happening, whether he was ready or not. "Was that about the puzzle?" "Yeah." "Is it still the kind where you don't know if it's good or bad?" He thought about $400,000 he'd never known existed, and a birth record with his father's name on it, and a will that was about to change the temperature of every room he walked into. "It's the kind where it's both at the same time," he said. She shouldered her backpack. "That's usually the most important kind," she said, and went to get her jacket. Richard Hart moved within 48 hours. Diane had predicted it. The speed still caught Nathan slightly off guard, not because he'd underestimated Richard, but because the machinery of it was larger than he'd fully imagined. By Thursday afternoon, the estate's legal team had received a formal letter from Whitmore and Chase, the law firm that had represented Heartstone Capital's board interests for over 2 decades. The letter challenged the authenticity of the sealed documents on 3 grounds: the validity of the sealing process itself, the integrity of the notary's record-keeping, and the legal standing of a prior will that had not been introduced during probate. Evelyn called him at 6 that evening. He was in his workshop, sanding a chair leg that didn't need sanding, which was what he did when he needed to do something with his hands while he thought. "You've seen it," she said. "Diane sent it over." Richard called me directly again. This time he used the word crisis. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it, a kind of controlled fury, held back through pure professional discipline. He told me the board has a fiduciary responsibility to protect the company from what he called speculative claims by unknown parties. He was very calm about it. He's been calm about it for 30 years, Nathan said. Yes. A pause. He also told me that my father would have wanted stability. Nathan set down the sandpaper. What did you say? I told him I'd be in touch. Another pause, longer. Nathan, 3 board members called me today. 3. In 6 hours. I haven't received 3 board calls in a single day since the quarterly crisis in March. He's working them. Who are they? 2 of them I expected. They've been Richard's people since before I took over. The third, she stopped. Gerald Marsh, he and my father were friends. They built the early company together. I thought he was... She stopped again. I thought he was mine. Nathan heard the particular quality of that mine. Not possessive, exactly. More like the sound of something you'd been counting on quietly and just noticed was no longer where you'd left it. He might still come back, Nathan said. He might. She didn't sound convinced. The emergency board meeting is in 2 weeks. Richard is moving for a formal resolution to reject the documents as inadmissible to the probate record. Can he do that? He can call for a vote on it. Whether he wins the vote is another question. She paused. He needs a majority. He's got 2 members locked. If he flips Marsh and 1 other, he has it. Then we make sure he doesn't flip Marsh. We, she said. You said we first, Nathan pointed out, a pause that might have contained something close to a real laugh. So I did. Then more quietly, Diane's going to need you to come in tomorrow. There are documents you need to sign and testimony you may need to give about the discovery of the box. The chain of evidence has to be airtight. I'll be there. And Nathan, she stopped. Yeah. Richard is going to come after your credibility. He'll look for anything. Your background, your finances, Lucy's mother, the 18 months after. She stopped. I had Diane run a preliminary background. I want to be able to tell you what Richard will find before he finds it. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He appreciated the directness enough not to be offended by it. The 18 months after Lucy's mother left, he said, I had some problems. I got help. My credit was bad for a few years. There was one incident, a bar, a disagreement that got physical, charges that were later dropped. Nothing since. Lucy's always been taken care of. He paused. I'm telling you because it's true, not because I'm ashamed. I know, Evelyn said. It won't be Richard who's ashamed. The next 2 weeks moved with the particular grinding quality of a conflict that is mostly administrative and therefore mostly invisible. The kind of fight where the battlefield is a conference table and the weapons are properly formatted documents and the damage accumulates in quiet increments. Diane prepared Nathan's formal statement regarding the discovery of the hidden box with the thoroughness of someone who had been in courtrooms long enough to know that the difference between a credible account and an incredible one often came down to the specific sensory detail. She asked him about the resistance of the tambour, the weight of the box, the exact position of every item inside it. She asked him why he'd brought it to Sylvia rather than opened the envelope himself, and he gave her the same answer he'd given Evelyn on the first day, which was that it wasn't addressed to him, and she noted it with the satisfaction of a woman who liked clean, unglamorous answers. At the same time, Evelyn was working the board. Nathan saw this mostly at a distance, through Diane's updates, through the occasional late evening call from Evelyn herself, through what he could read in the specific quality of tension in her voice when she appeared in the library doorway and wasn't quite ready to talk about what she'd just come from. She was good at it, the board work. He could tell even from the outside. She had a quality he'd noticed early, the ability to be in a room fully, to listen without performing listening. And he imagined it translated well to the particular theater of a boardroom where everyone was watching everyone else's tells. But she was also tired. He could see that too, in the way he'd learned to see it in her, the slightly less precise positioning of her chair when she entered a room, the mug of coffee she'd forget and leave on the library windowsill until it was cold. She was carrying the company and this fight and her own grief simultaneously, and she was doing it without complaint and without asking for anything from anyone, which he recognized as a quality that was both admirable and not particularly sustainable. He said none of this to her because she hadn't asked. But he filed it. The confession came from a woman named Doris Fenwick. She was 78 years old, and she had worked as a paralegal for the law firm that had handled Heartstone Capital's early corporate documents, the firm that had been replaced by Whitmore and Chase in 2001, and she was dying of congestive heart failure in a hospice facility in western Pennsylvania. And she had apparently decided that there were things that needed to be said before she ran out of time to say them. She called Diane Walsh's office directly, not through an intermediary, not through a lawyer of her own. She looked up the number herself, and she called. Diane called Nathan and Evelyn both and asked them to come in person. They sat in Diane's conference room, Nathan and Evelyn on one side of the table, Diane beside Evelyn, a digital recorder in the center, and Doris Fenwick spoke to them over a speakerphone from what sounded like a small, very quiet room. Her voice was thin but steady. She had the quality of someone who had been frightened for a long time and had gotten tired of it. "I drafted the sealing order," she said, "in 1993, for the birth record and the correspondence. I was told it was a routine matter of personal privacy, which it wasn't, and I knew it wasn't, and I did it anyway." She paused. Richard Hart handled the request personally. He came to the office himself, which partners didn't do. They sent associates. He came himself. That told me something. "What did it tell you?" Diane asked. "That it was important enough he didn't want anyone else's hands on it," Doris said, "and that he needed it to be done right, which meant he needed someone who was very good and who had something to lose." A pause. "I had a son in trouble at the time, legal trouble. Richard knew about it. He was very kind about it. He didn't make threats. He didn't have to." The room was quiet. "Did Robert Hart know about the sealing of the birth record?" Diane asked. "He knew about the letter and the correspondence being sealed. He asked for that himself. He wanted Nathan protected from press or public attention," he said. Doris's voice thinned further. "He did not know that Richard had arranged for the birth record to be sealed as well. That was Richard acting on his own. Robert would have been furious." "How do you know he didn't know?" Evelyn asked. It was the first time she'd spoken. Her voice was quiet and very controlled. "Because 6 months after the filing," Doris said, "Robert came to the office. Not to our firm. He came to find me specifically. Waited outside. He asked me what had been done and whether Nathan's birth record was part of it." A pause. "I told him it wasn't, because Richard had told me to say that if I was ever asked." No one spoke. "Robert left," Doris continued. "He looked, I don't know how to describe it exactly. Relieved, I think. And I watched him go, and I knew I'd just lied to a man about his own child. And I told myself it was done, and I couldn't undo it. And I lived with that for 30 years. Her voice had gone very quiet. "I'm not asking for anything. I just want it on record before I can't put it there." Nathan was looking at the table. He was aware of Evelyn to his left, the quality of stillness in her that was different from her usual stillness, a kind that came from something being actively held back. He didn't look at her. "Thank you, Doris," Diane said. "We're going to need a formal affidavit." "I know. I've already drafted it. I have a copy with the hospice administrator and a copy with my daughter, who's been told what to do with it." A pause. "I'm not going to make it to any courtroom, Ms. Walsh, but I made sure it won't matter." Diane filed the affidavit the following Monday. By Tuesday, Whitmore and Chase had responded with a motion challenging Doris Fenwick's competency as a witness, citing her medical condition and what they described as the emotional unreliability of deathbed statements. Nathan read the motion in his truck, parked outside the school where he'd just dropped Lucy off, and felt a kind of cold anger that was different from the sharp kind. It was a slow, flat anger, the kind that came from watching something cynical be done competently. He drove to the estate. Evelyn was in the formal sitting room off the main hallway, a room he hadn't been in before, large and slightly overfurnished in the way of rooms used for appearances rather than living. She was on the phone when he knocked on the open door, and she held up a finger, finished the call, and looked at him. "I read the motion," he said. "So did I." She set the phone on the side table. Her face had the tight quality that came with running on something past the point of ordinary resources. They're going to drag Doris Fenwick's medical history into a deposition proceeding while she's in hospice. That's what this is. Richard authorized that. Richard doesn't authorize anything, Evelyn said. He suggests, and other people do the authorizing. He's been doing it for 40 years. It's very clean. She paused. Gerald Marsh called me last night. Nathan looked at her. He wants to meet, she said, without Richard knowing. She looked at her hands. He said he has something he should have given me 8 months ago. The board meeting was 9 days away. Peace. Gerald Marsh was 73, a compact, careful man with white hair and the somewhat haunted look of someone who had made a decision they had been living with uncomfortably. He met Evelyn and Nathan in Diane's conference room on a Thursday afternoon, without his own counsel, which Diane had noted was either very trusting or a statement of intent. He set a folder on the table without being asked. "Your father gave me this 2 years ago," he said, looking at Evelyn. "He told me to keep it and to give it to you when the time was right, and that I would know when the time was right because someone would ask me a question I couldn't answer honestly without it." He paused. "Richard called me last week and asked me to confirm that the prior will was invalid on procedural grounds. I knew enough about the will to know it wasn't." He pushed the folder forward. "So here we are." Inside the folder were 2 items. A signed declaration from Robert Hart, dated 14 months before his death, confirming Nathan's identity as his biological son and his intention to correct the probate record. And a personal letter from Robert to Gerald, which said, among other things, "If Richard has done what I suspect he has done, the evidence will eventually surface whether I am here to help it or not. I want there to be one person in that boardroom who knew me well enough to tell them what I actually believed." Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she folded it and held it in her lap and looked at the window for a moment. Gerald Marsh watched her. He had the expression of a man delivering a debt payment that was long overdue and did not quite cover the interest. "Why did you wait?" she asked. Not accusatory, just asking. "Because I told myself it wasn't the right time yet." He paused. "And because I was afraid of what Richard would do, which is not a good reason, but it's the honest one." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Thank you for being here." "I should have been here sooner," he said. The emergency board meeting was called for the following Thursday at 9 in the morning in the Heartstone Capitol boardroom on the 14th floor of their downtown building, a room Nathan had never been in, a world that had never been his, though apparently it was adjacent to his name in documents filed before he could walk. He drove Evelyn that morning because Diane had suggested a single vehicle for the optics of it, which was the kind of consideration Nathan found faintly absurd but understood the logic of. He pulled up outside her building at 8:15. She came down the ramp at the building's side entrance in her chair, wearing a dark jacket and the specific expression of someone who had slept less than they needed and was not going to let that be visible. She didn't say good morning. She got in the car and looked straight ahead. He pulled out into traffic. After 2 blocks, she said, "He's going to try to table the documents on the basis that introducing them disrupts the company's fiduciary continuity. That's his move today. He'll make it sound like protecting the company. It will be about protecting Richard." "I know," Nathan said. "If Marsh holds, Marsh will hold." He showed up. Showing up to a meeting isn't holding. "I know that too." He waited at a light. "Do you trust Diane's read on the other votes?" "Yes." "Then we have it, barely." "Barely," she agreed. The light changed. He drove. "Nathan," she said after a while. "Yeah." "Whatever happens in there—" She stopped. Started again. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that what my father did wasn't what I would have done. The years of silence, the watching from a distance. I understand why, partly, but I want to say it out loud regardless." He looked straight ahead. The downtown buildings were filling the windshield, gray glass and indifferent. "I know," he said. "I don't think that's enough." "I know that too," he said. "But it's a start." She was quiet the rest of the way. He parked in the building's garage and they took the elevator to the 14th floor. And when the doors opened onto the corridor that led to the boardroom, they could already hear voices inside. The sound of a conflict that had been building for 30 years and had finally, today, located a room small enough to happen in. Nathan walked the corridor and thought about his father's handwriting in the margins of old books, about the specific word no, written in emphatic capital letters next to ideas that deserved to be questioned. He thought it was probably the most important thing Robert Hart had left him. Not the will, not the company, not the $400,000 in an account he hadn't known existed until 3 weeks ago. Just that one instinct, the stubbornness to look at a thing being presented as settled and say, I don't think that's right. He pushed open the boardroom door. Richard Hart was already seated at the head of the table. He was a large man, physically imposing in the way of someone who had learned early to use his size as part of his presence. He had the same dark eyes as Evelyn, which Nathan noticed and then put aside. He looked at Nathan with an expression that was composed and controlled, and underneath both of those things, very cold. Nathan looked back at him without performance. Evelyn wheeled herself to the table without hesitation and set her folders down. Let's begin, she said. The boardroom had 14 chairs and 8 people in it, and the air inside it was the specific kind that accumulated in rooms where significant decisions had been made for a long time. Not stale, exactly, but weighted. The table was long and dark-grained, the kind that had been chosen to imply permanence. The windows behind Richard Hart's seat looked out over the city in a way that was clearly intentional, the light coming in behind him, making everyone else squint slightly when they looked his direction. Nathan noticed all of this and set it aside. Diane was already seated to Evelyn's left, with 2 document portfolios stacked in front of her. Gerald Marsh sat 3 seats down on the same side, hands folded on the table, not looking at Richard. The 2 board members Nathan had mentally categorized as Richards, a man named Caldwell and a woman named Priya Sethna, sat directly across. 2 others, a retired banker named Howell and a younger woman named Claire Tesaro, who ran the company's risk analysis division, were positioned at the far end, giving nothing away. Richard looked at Nathan once when he sat down. A long look, assessing, the kind that was used to producing a reaction. Nathan met it and didn't perform anything in return, and Richard looked away first, which Nathan noted without satisfaction. Evelyn called the meeting to order without preamble. We're here on an emergency basis to address a matter of legal and fiduciary significance to the company, she said. I'm going to present documents for the board's review, ask that they be entered into the formal record, and request the board's position on a motion to acknowledge their relevance to the ongoing probate matter. She looked around the table with the practiced evenness of someone who had spent 8 months making herself unmovable in rooms like this one. Mr. Hart has requested the floor before we begin. Richard leaned forward slightly, which was the kind of movement that in a smaller man would look like leaning in, and in a man of his size looked like a shift of weight that changed the geometry of the room. I want to say, before anything else is presented, he said, in the measured baritone of someone who had been addressing rooms for 40 years, that I called this emergency session to protect something we all care about. This company was built by my brother over the course of 30 years. He gave his life to it. And what we're about to discuss is an attempt by an outside party, a stranger, to destabilize the succession structure he built, based on documents of uncertain provenance, introduced during an active probate period. He paused. I have nothing against Mr. Cole personally, but I have a responsibility to the company, to its employees, to its investors, and to Robert's memory. He said Robert's memory the way people said things they knew were rhetorical. Not because they were false exactly, but because they were deployed. Evelyn waited until he was finished. Thank you, Richard. Diane. Diane opened the first portfolio and began, efficiently and without drama, to walk the board through the document chain. The birth record and its provenance. The Bassett and Holt sealing order and its history. The authenticated letter, the prior will, and its proper execution. She moved through it the way a good lawyer moved through evidence, not performing the significance, but letting the facts carry themselves. Richard interrupted twice. Once to question the chain of custody for the sealed documents, which Diane addressed in 2 sentences. Once to suggest that the prior will's failure to surface during probate constituted a procedural forfeiture of its validity, which Evelyn addressed by referencing the specific statute under which sealed testamentary instruments were legally exempt from standard probate timelines. Richard looked at her for a moment after that. You've been preparing this for a while, he said. I've been preparing it since the documents arrived, she said. Yes. He turned his gaze to Nathan. You understand what you're claiming here. Nathan looked at him steadily. I'm not claiming anything. The documents speak for themselves. You're claiming a stake in a company you've had no part in building. I'm not claiming a stake, Nathan said. I'm asking for the legal record to reflect the truth. Those are different things. The practical effect is identical. Only if you decide to make it so. Nathan kept his voice level. Not cold, not aggressive, just even. My father left documentation. My father had the right to leave documentation. What happens with it legally is a separate question from whether it should be acknowledged as true. Richard looked at him for a long moment. Your father, he said, with a very slight emphasis that was probably imperceptible to everyone in the room who wasn't Nathan. Yes, Nathan said. My father. The room was quiet. Caldwell cleared his throat. Richard, I think we should hear from Diane on the legal standing before we... I want to understand what Mr. Cole wants, Richard said, not breaking eye contact with Nathan. Concretely. Because I've heard a lot of language about truth and records, and I want to know what that translates to in practice. Nathan looked at him. I want my name on the birth record to be acknowledged as legally accurate. I want my father's prior will to be entered into the probate record. I want Doris Fenwick's affidavit to be considered in any legal assessment of the sealing of the original documents. He paused. That's all. Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. You don't want control of the company. No. You don't want the voting interest the prior will conveys. I'll hold it, Nathan said. I won't use it to disrupt operations. That's not what I came here for. Richard looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at Evelyn. You believe him, Richard said to her. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, she said. I do. Something moved across Richard's face. It was the first moment in the meeting where his control slipped even slightly. A small tightening around the eyes that could have been contempt and could have been something closer to fear. Not of Nathan, not of the documents, of the particular combination of the two of them on the same side of the table. Then let me say something clearly, Richard said, and his voice dropped to the register he probably used when he actually wanted to be heard, below the performance of it. I built the governance of this company to survive exactly this kind of disruption. Every clause, every protection. I did it because the alternative was watching everything Robert built get torn apart by something that should have stayed buried. I did it to protect this company. I did it to protect Robert. You did it to protect the structure that protected your position, Evelyn said. The room became very still. Richard looked at her. It was, Nathan thought, the look of a man who had miscalculated. Not the facts, not the documents, but the woman across the table from him, who he had believed was manageable and had now said out loud the thing that no one in this room had said out loud before. Evelyn, you buried a birth record, she said. You sealed documentation that belonged to a living person. You spent 30 years making sure my father couldn't correct a lie that you told him was the only way to protect what he'd built. And then you put me in this chair. She gestured briefly at the CEO position she occupied. At the table. At the whole room. Because you thought I would be easier to control than whoever else might have come. Her voice was steady. I've been thinking about how to say this for 6 weeks. I want it to be on record. Richard did not answer immediately. He looked at his hands, then back up at her, with the expression of a man who had been in rooms like this for decades and was deciding how to absorb a blow without showing it had landed. You have a vote to call, he said finally. His voice had gone flatter, more careful. Yes, she said. We do. He showed. Diane called the vote formally, which was what the governance documents required, and each board member stated their position, which was also what was required, and what was not required but happened anyway was the silence that fell between each answer and the next. Caldwell voted against entering the documents into the probate record. Priya Sethna voted the same. Both of them looked at Richard when they did it, which told Nathan everything about why. Howell voted in favor. Claire Tesaro voted in favor. Both of them looked at the table when they did it, which told Nathan something different. Not cowardice, exactly, but the specific discomfort of people voting against the prevailing gravity of a room they'd spent years in. Gerald Marsh voted in favor. He said it clearly and without hesitation, and he looked at neither Richard nor Evelyn but at some middle distance, the expression of a man delivering on an overdue debt. The count was 4 in favor, 2 against, 1 abstaining, a younger member named Park, who said carefully that he needed more time to review the documents and didn't feel he could vote in good conscience either way. Under the governance rules, an abstention didn't constitute a blocking vote. The motion carried. Richard sat with it for a moment. Then he straightened in his chair, reorganized the papers in front of him with deliberate care, and said, "I want to note my formal objection for the record." "Noted," Diane said, and wrote it down. Itiam. The meeting broke without ceremony, the way meetings usually did. People gathered their things, quiet conversations started at the edges of the room, the formal tension giving way to the smaller, more personal kind. Nathan sat for a moment while the room moved around him. He was aware of Richard standing at the window, looking out at the city, his back to the room. Not making an exit, just standing. Nathan stood and picked up his folder and started toward the door. Then he stopped. He wasn't entirely sure why. It wasn't sentiment. It wasn't the need to have the last word. It was something more like the instinct he got when a piece of furniture had something wrong with it that he hadn't fully identified. The feeling that there was one more thing to understand before he walked away. He crossed the room and stood a few feet behind Richard. "I know you don't believe me," Nathan said, "about not wanting the company. I understand why you don't. It would be convenient for me if you believed it, and I'm the person who benefits from it." Richard didn't turn around. He looked out the window. "But I'm going to say it anyway," Nathan said. "Whatever you told yourself about why you did what you did, I'm not going to tell you that's wrong. I don't know what you were protecting. I don't know what you were afraid of. I wasn't there." He paused. "What I know is that there was a woman who raised her son alone and died when he was 6, and the man who loved her spent 30 years not saying so out loud. And that's a thing that happened regardless of what anyone in this room decides about documents." Richard said nothing. "I'm not asking you to apologize," Nathan said. "I'm not asking for anything from you at all. I just wanted you to know that the person you buried in that birth record is a real person. He has a daughter. He has a workshop. He had a mother he barely remembers." He paused. He existed whether the document said so or not. He turned and walked to the door. Richard said without turning from the window, "Your mother was remarkable." Nathan stopped. "I met her once," Richard said, "at the company's first anniversary event in 1989. She was there with Robert. She was the only person in the room who said exactly what she thought." A pause. "I knew then that she was a problem." Nathan stood at the door for a moment. "She sounds like she was," he said. He left. Evelyn was in the corridor. She had been waiting, or not waiting exactly, positioned near the elevator in the way she sometimes positioned herself, present without imposing. She looked at him when he came out and read his face with the directness she'd had since the beginning. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "Nothing useful," Nathan said. He looked. She stopped. "What?" "Old," she said. For the first time, he looked old. They took the elevator down in silence. In the lobby, the November light was coming through the glass front in long, pale strips, and the city outside moved with the indifference of a city that had continued entirely unchanged while a 30-year-old buried fact surfaced in a room on the 14th floor. Nathan held the door for Evelyn's chair on the way out. "What do you need to do now?" she asked. "Pick Lucy up at 3:30, he said. "Get groceries. I told her we'd make soup tonight." She looked at him. "You're making soup?" "She likes it when it's cold out." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then in a different tone. Not the CEO tone, not the controlled for the boardroom tone, just the voice she used when she wasn't performing anything. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "That. The soup. The 3:30 pickup. The—" She gestured, imprecisely, at something she apparently couldn't name exactly. "All of it. All the time. While everything else is happening." Nathan thought about it honestly. "I didn't have the option of it not being there," he said. "She needed dinner every night, whether the rest of my life was together or not. After a while, it stopped feeling like holding two things at once and started feeling like they were the same thing. Evelyn looked at the sidewalk for a moment. I don't have that, she said. I know. I have the company, which is something. It's... She stopped. It's not nothing. It's a lot, he said. You're good at it. I know I'm good at it, she said. It came out without arrogance. Just the statement of someone who had been competent for so long it was no longer something she needed confirmed. That's not the same as it being enough. He looked at her, standing in the November light outside the building that bore her name, and he thought about all the rooms she'd been in these past weeks, every one of them a room where she was alone on the side of the right thing and had to hold that position without letting it show that it was costing her. He thought about the mug of cold coffee on the library windowsill. About the word mine when she'd talked about Gerald Marsh, the small, audible crack of realizing something you'd counted on had moved. Come have soup, he said. She looked at him. I'm serious, he said. Lucy will talk the entire time about weather systems or something she found in the yard. You won't have to say anything meaningful. It'll be a relief. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile exactly, but the thing that a smile was made from, the underlying softening before the form of it was decided. I have 3 calls this evening. After the calls. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked away, at the street, at the city, at the ordinary traffic of a Thursday afternoon that did not know or care what had happened on the 14th floor. Okay, she said quietly. After the calls. Lucy was thrilled. Not in the performed way children sometimes were when a guest arrived. In the specific, slightly chaotic way she got when something genuinely surprised her, and she hadn't decided yet how to organize the feeling. She had not been told about Evelyn in any detail, only that Nathan worked at her house and that she ran a company, and Lucy filed that information and then mostly ignored it in favor of showing Evelyn her weather poster, which was still on the kitchen table because Nathan hadn't had the heart to take it down. This is a really good rendering of a cold front, Evelyn said, looking at it with genuine attention. I know, Lucy said. The teacher gave me an A- because she said the historical section went off topic, but I think she's wrong. What was the historical section? I wrote about the blizzard of 1888 because I thought it added context. Lucy sat down next to Evelyn's chair with the casual ease of someone who had not yet learned to treat a wheelchair as anything other than a chair. Did you know 300 people died in it, and it was like 2 feet of snow in one day? I did not know that. It shut down the whole eastern seaboard. New York City was basically stopped. Lucy considered. The teacher said it was fascinating but not relevant. I disagree. I would have given you full marks, Evelyn said. Lucy looked at her with the expression of a child who has found an unexpected ally. Do you want to sit here while my dad makes soup? Yes, Evelyn said. I do. Nathan stood at the stove with his back to them, listening to Lucy begin a detailed account of the current science unit on ocean currents, and thought about a boardroom on the 14th floor and a man standing at a window, and a letter written to a 1-year-old, and his mother who laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. He thought about 30 years of a story running underground, and what it felt like when it finally surfaced. Not the dramatic eruption you imagined, but this. A kitchen. Soup on the stove. A 9-year-old explaining the Gulf Stream to a CEO in a wheelchair with the earnest certainty of someone who has decided this person is worth educating. The kitchen smelled like onions and butter and the particular warmth of a house in late November with the heat on. It was, Nathan thought, about as far from a boardroom as a person could get. He stirred the soup and let that be enough. The legal resolution took 3 more weeks. Not the dramatic, instantaneous kind of resolution that happened in movies, where a judge slammed a gavel and the music swelled and everyone knew in a single moment where they stood. The real kind. The kind that happened in conference rooms and through email chains and over the phone between lawyers who spoke in precise, careful language and billed by the hour. The kind where the outcome was actually decided in the boardroom on a Thursday morning and then had to be slowly, laboriously translated into the official record of the world, one filing at a time. Richard Hart resigned from the board chairmanship 11 days after the vote. The announcement came through the company's legal communications office, in language so sanitized it was almost impressive. pursuing other interests, grateful for the opportunity, proud of the company's continued growth. And it told anyone who knew how to read it exactly what it was. A man accepting the terms of a defeat he'd been handed and choosing the version that let him keep his dignity in the room. Not accountability, not apology, just the clean administrative act of stepping back before he was pushed. Nathan read the announcement on his phone in the workshop, between finishing a chair leg and starting on the drawer mechanism of a Victorian writing desk. He put the phone face down on the workbench and went back to the drawer. He didn't feel what he might have expected to feel. Not triumph, not closure. He'd learned enough by now to be suspicious of the word closure, which people used to describe a feeling he wasn't sure existed in the form they meant. He felt something quieter, something like the specific settling that happened when a piece of furniture that had been structurally wrong for a long time was finally corrected. Not the joy of creation, just the particular rightness of a thing that was now bearing its weight the way it was supposed to. Doris Fenwick died 4 days before the final probate order was issued. Diane called to tell him. Her voice was careful and neutral in the way it got when she was delivering something she thought he should know, but wasn't sure how he'd take it. He thanked her and sat with it for a while. He hadn't met Doris. He had only heard her voice through a speakerphone, thin and steady, delivering a 30-year-old truth from a small, quiet room while she was running out of time to deliver it. He didn't know her, but he thought about the specific courage of what she'd done. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind with an audience, just the private decision to call a number and say the thing that had needed saying for 3 decades. And he found himself moved by it in the way you were moved by things that had no direct relationship to you, but that told you something about what people were actually capable of when it finally mattered enough. He went to the workshop and built a small walnut box, the kind with a fitted lid and dovetail joints. Not for any particular purpose, just because his hands needed to make something that was clean and good and straightforward. He gave it to Lucy when it was finished. She used it to keep her collection of interesting rocks. The probate order came on a Tuesday. Diane called, then emailed the documents, then called again to walk him through what each page meant, because that was the kind of lawyer she was. Nathan sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and read through the formal language that said, in the specific, impersonal grammar of legal documents, that he was the biological son of Robert James Hart, that the prior will was valid and entered into the record, that he held majority voting interest in Heartstone Capital as its largest single shareholder, and that the trust established for him in 1993 was formally released to his name. He sat with the documents for a long time after the call. He thought about the index card in the hidden box. My greatest riddle is not a question. It is a person. He'd been thinking about that line, off and on, for weeks. At first he'd read it as Robert pointing toward Nathan, the son he'd hidden, the person who was the riddle. But sitting at the kitchen table with the probate order in front of him, he thought maybe he'd been reading it wrong. Maybe the riddle wasn't Nathan. Maybe the riddle was Robert himself. A man who had made serious, consequential mistakes and had spent the rest of his life carrying them without correcting them publicly, but also without abandoning them entirely, quietly funding a trust, hiding documentation, planting the seeds of a truth he couldn't plant openly. A man who was neither the villain of the story nor the hero of it. Just a person who had gotten something badly wrong and had tried, imperfectly, in private, to make it a little less wrong. That was a more complicated riddle than Nathan had initially reached for. He respected it more, too. He called Evelyn. "It came," he said. "I know," she said. "Diane copied me." A pause. "How are you?" "I'm not sure yet. Ask me in a week." "I'll ask you in a week," she said, without irony. "How are you?" She was quiet for a moment, which was different from her usual way of being quiet. This one had a weight to it, something being considered rather than just withheld. "I've been sitting here thinking about what I want to do with the company," she said. "Not operationally. I mean, what I want it to be, what I want it for." She paused. "I've been running it like a problem to be managed. I haven't been thinking about it like something I actually chose." "And now?" "Now I think I want to choose it," she said, "properly. Not because it was handed to me and I have to hold it together, because it's worth doing well. Nathan looked at the probate order on his kitchen table. "I'm going to make it official," he said, "what I said in the boardroom. I'll hold the voting interest. I'll be available if you need a second voice on something major, but the company is yours to run." "I know," she said. "I want it in writing, Evelyn, so there's no ambiguity." "I know," she said again. "Diane's already drafting it." A pause. "Nathan?" "Yeah." "Thank you. Not for the voting structure, for—" She stopped. "For not being what Richard thought you were going to be." He looked out the kitchen window at the backyard where the November trees had gone bare and the light was the flat gray of a season that had completed itself. "I'm not sure that deserves a thank you," he said. "I just was who I was." "That's the part that deserved it," she said. He told Lucy on a Saturday morning, the way he'd always told her important things, at the kitchen table, with nowhere to be, without building it up into a presentation. He told her about Robert Hart, and about Margaret, and about the box in the desk and what was in it. He told her about the letter, and about Doris Fenwick, and about what the probate order said. He told her about Richard and the 30 years of buried documentation and what it meant that it had finally surfaced. Lucy listened the way she always listened to things that mattered. Completely still, her hands around her cereal bowl, her eyes on his face. She didn't interrupt. She let him finish. Then she said, "So your dad was the man who owned the house?" "Yes." "And he knew about you the whole time?" "He knew. He made some bad choices about it. He also tried, in some ways, to fix them. Not well enough, but some." Lucy considered this. "That's sad," she said. Not dramatically, just factually, the way she processed things. "Yeah," he said. "It is. He didn't get to meet you." "No." "Did he know you were good at your job?" Nathan looked at his daughter. "I don't know," he said honestly. "He might have." "I think he knew," she said, "because he wrote the thing about the riddle being a person. And a riddle is something you want someone to figure out. So he wanted someone to find you." She paused, with the expression of a 9-year-old who has arrived at something she finds structurally satisfying. "He was probably proud of you even though he didn't say it. Some people are bad at saying it." Nathan sat with that for a moment. It was not, he thought, an inaccurate read. "Are you okay?" Lucy asked. "I'm working on it." "That's the right answer," she said. "Miss Ferraro says pretending to be fine when you're not fine is a waste of energy." Miss Ferraro sounds like a smart person. "She's okay," Lucy said. "She still thinks the blizzard section was off topic." He visited the grave for the first time 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in early December when the ground was cold but not yet frozen, and the cemetery on the western edge of Dunmore was almost entirely empty. He had looked up the location online. Evelyn had told him what cemetery, which section, and he drove there alone, which is how he had decided to do this first time. He needed one visit without witnesses before he understood what it was going to feel like. The headstone was simple. Nathan had expected something larger, something more commensurate with the size of the company and the estate and the whole weight of the man's biography. But it was plain gray granite with the name and the dates and a single line beneath. He built with care. That was all. He didn't know if Robert had chosen it or Evelyn had chosen it. Either way, it was right. Nathan stood in front of it for a while. He didn't know what he expected to feel. The honest answer was that he felt several things at the same time, which refused to organize themselves into a single clean emotion. He felt something like grief. Not the sharp kind, but the particular ache of mourning something you never had, rather than something you lost, which was its own specific variety. He felt something like anger, still, a residue of it, the kind that didn't require a target anymore but hadn't quite finished burning. He felt something like relief, which surprised him the most, the feeling of a question that had been in the background of his entire life having finally been given a definitive, if complicated, answer. Mostly, he felt like himself, which was, he supposed, the most honest thing he could have felt. He had brought nothing to leave. He hadn't planned it as a ritual. He stood there in the December cold with his hands in his pockets and said nothing out loud because there was nothing that needed saying out loud. The documents had been filed, the record had been corrected, his name was where his name was supposed to be. Whatever Robert Hart had needed to hear from his son, He had needed to hear it 30 years ago, and the time for that had passed. What Nathan did, standing there, was let himself be a son for a moment. Not perform it, not explain it, not justify it. Just stand at his father's grave and be the person who had that right, officially and finally. And let that be what it was. He stayed for about 20 minutes. Then he drove home. Lucy asked that evening if she could come next time. She had known where he was going. He'd told her, and she had very deliberately not asked to come along, which he recognized as an act of unusual restraint for a 9-year-old, and which told him she understood that this particular trip was his to take alone first. "Yeah," he said. "Next time." "Can I bring something for the headstone?" "Like what?" She thought about it. "I don't know yet. Something I pick. Is that okay?" "That's okay," he said. She nodded and went back to the book she was reading, satisfied, the way she got when a decision had been made and could be filed under sorted and returned to later. Nathan looked at her reading on the couch in the lamplight of a December evening and thought about legacy. Not in the boardroom sense, not the legal document sense, not even the estate and fortune sense. He thought about it in the specific, ordinary, daily sense of what you passed on to the person who came after you. Not the money, not the name, not the documented history, though that mattered too. The other things. The instinct to look harder at something that felt wrong. The willingness to say no out loud in the margins of ideas that deserved questioning. The stubbornness to be who you were, even when someone more powerful needed you to be less. He had gotten some of that from his mother, from what little he remembered, and from what Carol had told him. He had gotten some of it from the years of building a life without anyone to hand it to him. And maybe, he let himself think it without deciding if it was true yet, he had gotten some of it from a man he'd never met, whose books he'd cataloged, whose chair he'd sat in, whose handwriting he'd been reading in margins for weeks before he understood whose son he was. Maybe that was the inheritance that actually passed, not the documented kind, the other kind. He met Evelyn at the estate the following week, not for work. The catalog had been officially completed and delivered, but because she'd asked him to come, and because by now the distinction between the estate as a workplace and the estate as a place he had some complicated personal relationship with had blurred past the point of pretending otherwise. She was in the library when he arrived. The room looked almost exactly the same as the first day he'd walked into it, except the secretary desk had been moved out from behind the floor lamp and positioned properly against the wall, restored now, the tambour running smooth, the water ring on the writing surface treated and refinished. He had done that work himself after the catalog was finished, without being asked. Evelyn was at the desk when he came in, not working, just sitting beside it, her hand resting on the surface in the particular way of someone touching something that belongs to a person who is gone. "It looks good," she said, without turning around. "The oxalic treatment worked," he said. "The finish isn't quite original, but it's close." She turned. She looked, he thought, different from the first day. Not lighter, exactly. She was still carrying what she carried, the company and the grief and the specific exhaustion of being a person who held a lot up. But something in her had settled. Something had stopped bracing. "I've been thinking about what to do with the library," she said. "What do you mean?" "He used it to think," she said. "He used it to work things out, and I've been keeping it preserved. Not as a room, as a kind of..." She stopped. "Monument. I've been keeping it like a monument, and not using it." "What do you want to use it for?" She looked at the shelves for a moment. "I want to actually work in it. I want to bring the things I'm trying to figure out in here and sit with them the way he did." She paused. "He left all his thinking in this room. I'd like to add some of mine to it." Nathan looked at the wing-backed chair with the worn patch on the left armrest. "That seems right," he said. She looked at him. "I want to talk about something, formally but informally." He sat down. She positioned her chair near the window, which was her thinking position, and he recognized by now that when she was in that position, the conversation was going to matter. "I've been restructuring the senior leadership team," she said. "I've also been thinking about what the company's relationship with the probate resolution should look like publicly. Not legally, Diane's handled that, but in terms of what the company says about itself and its history and what it's acknowledging." She looked at him. I want to tell the truth, not a press release version of the truth. The actual version that our founder had a son he wasn't permitted to acknowledge, that history was covered up by a board member for 30 years, and that the record has now been corrected. That's going to be uncomfortable for the company. Yes, she said. I know. I also think the alternative, the managed, sanitized version where Richard quietly left and nothing is explained, is worse. It teaches the wrong thing. It says the institution matters more than the person it buried. Nathan looked at her. You've already decided. I've already decided, she agreed. But I wanted to tell you first, because it's your family's story and you have a right to know what I'm going to say about it. He considered that for a moment. The specific respect of it, being told rather than informed after. What are you going to say? The truth, she said, that Heartstone Capital was built by a man who made mistakes and was also prevented from correcting them. That those mistakes hurt someone who deserved better. That the company acknowledges that and is committed to operating differently. She paused. I'll leave it at that. I won't make it a narrative about redemption. I hate those. So do I, Nathan said. I know, she said. That's partly why I'm telling you. He looked out the library window at the December garden, stripped bare and angular in the cold. He thought about his father's margins, the arguments held with dead historians, the emphatic no-beside claims that deserved to be questioned, and he thought about what it meant to insist on accuracy when the comfortable version was available. It cost something. It always cost something. The question was whether you were willing to pay it. Tell the truth, he said. Yeah. She nodded. They were quiet for a moment. I'm going to bring Lucy to the grave next week, he said. She wants to leave something. Evelyn looked at him. Can I come? He looked at her. She was asking the way she asked the things she actually wanted, directly, without dressing it up, with the slight specific vulnerability of someone who was not accustomed to asking and was doing it anyway. Yeah, he said. You can come. What? They went on a Saturday, the three of them. It was the kind of December day that couldn't quite commit to being cold. Not warm, not bitter, just gray and still and quiet in the way of late autumn carrying over into early winter. The cemetery was empty except for an older man walking a dog in the far section, the dog uninterested in the walk, the man patient about it. Nathan drove. Lucy sat in the back seat and was, for once, mostly quiet. The specific quiet of a child who understands that where they are going matters and is adjusting accordingly. She had the thing she wanted to leave in her jacket pocket and had not told Nathan what it was, and he had not asked. Evelyn rode in the passenger seat. She looked out the window at the passing landscape, the gray bare trees, the occasional farmhouse, the fields that had been harvested and were now just the stubble of what had been there, and she said without particular preamble, My father used to drive this way sometimes, on Sundays. He'd just drive, no destination. He'd take me when I was small. I'd sit in the back seat and look out the window, and he'd put on old radio programs. She paused. I haven't thought about that in years. What kind of radio programs? Lucy asked from the back seat. Evelyn turned slightly. The old ones. Mystery dramas mostly, very theatrical, lots of sound effects. That sounds amazing, Lucy said. It was, Evelyn said. He'd do the voices sometimes. Badly. My dad does voices when he reads to me, Lucy said. Also badly. That's a universal constant, Evelyn said. Dads do bad voices. Nathan kept his eyes on the road and said nothing, which was the correct response. Lucy made a small sound of agreement and went back to her window, and the three of them rode the rest of the way in the comfortable kind of quiet that required nothing from anyone. At the grave, Lucy stood for a moment looking at the headstone. She read the name and the dates and the line beneath. Then she looked at her father. He built with care, she said. That's what it says. Yeah, Nathan said. She considered it. That's a good thing to be remembered for. I think so too. She reached into her pocket and took out what she'd brought. It was a small yellow flower, a late chrysanthemum, one of the stubborn ones that persisted into December in sheltered corners of gardens. Nathan didn't ask where she'd gotten it. She crouched down and placed it at the base of the headstone with the particular care of a 9-year-old who has decided this action matters and is therefore going to do it properly. She stood back up. She looked at the stone for a moment longer. Then she said quietly, "Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm his granddaughter. I thought you should know." Nathan stood very still. He was not a man who cried easily, and he did not cry now, but he felt something move through him that was large and quiet, and that he thought would take a long time to fully understand. It was not grief exactly. It was not joy. It was something in the territory between them, the specific feeling of something that had been absent for a very long time being acknowledged, not filled in, not replaced, but acknowledged, named, given its correct weight. He put his hand on his daughter's shoulder. She leaned against him slightly, the way she'd been doing since she was small, the automatic lean of someone who knew where the solid things were. Evelyn was a few feet away, her chair positioned on the path that ran alongside the grave plots. She was looking at the headstone with an expression Nathan had not seen on her before, not the controlled professional expression, not the grieving daughter expression she wore when she thought no one was watching, but something more open than either of those. Something that looked simply like a person looking at a person they had lost and allowing themselves to miss them without managing it. After a while, she said, "I used to talk to him when I was angry with him, out loud, in the house, when no one was around. Just say things into the room." She paused. "I thought it was strange. I kept thinking I should stop." "Did it help?" Nathan asked. "Yes," she said. "Unfortunately, yes. Because I wanted it not to, and it did anyway." Nathan looked at the headstone. "I don't know if I'll do that," he said. "Talk to him. I don't think I'm there yet." "You don't have to be." "No," he said. "I know." Lucy had moved a few feet away and was looking at another headstone nearby, reading it with the comprehensive curiosity she applied to things. She was giving them space, or she was simply interested in what was around her. With Lucy, both things were usually true at the same time. "I've been thinking about something," Evelyn said. "What?" "I've been thinking that I've been running a company my father built and trying to understand it as his thing, his vision, his structure, his legacy." She looked at the grave. "I think I need to stop thinking of it as his and start thinking of it as mine, the thing I inherited and am choosing, which is different." "It is different," Nathan said. "I don't want to run it the way he ran it. I respect what he built. I also think some of it needs to change, and I've been holding back because changing it felt like a judgment of him." She paused. "It's not. Or it is, and that's okay. He wasn't right about everything. Most people aren't." "No," Nathan said, "including me." "Including you," he agreed. She looked at him. "You're not going to soften that." "You didn't ask me to." Something that was definitely a real smile this time moved across her face. Not the controlled near smile, an actual one, brief and slightly tired and entirely genuine. "No," she said. "I didn't." On the walk back to the car, the path ran slightly downhill through the older section of the cemetery, winding between rows of stones. Lucy took her father's hand. That part was unremarkable. She did that. She'd been reaching for his hand in parking lots and on sidewalks and leaving places since she was 4, and she still did it at 9, though he knew the window for this was closing and he took it every time without making it a thing. What happened next was unremarkable, and also, in its quiet way, everything. After a moment, she reached for Evelyn's hand. It was not premeditated. Nathan could see that. Lucy was not a theatrical child. She didn't do gestures for effect. She reached for Evelyn's hand the way she sometimes reached for Carol's hand, or the hands of people she had decided, through some private evaluation process that Nathan had never fully decoded, were worth reaching for. Evelyn looked down. A beat of surprise, real, unguarded, the kind that bypassed composure entirely. Her hand was on the wheel of her chair and Lucy had closed her fingers around it, and for just a second Evelyn looked like someone who did not know what to do with an unexpected kindness. Then she turned her hand gently and held Lucy's back. They walked down the hill like that, Nathan and Lucy and Evelyn, through the gray December quiet of a cemetery that had one more name properly recorded in it now, toward a car parked on the gravel path at the bottom, toward a Saturday afternoon that still had all the ordinary small mechanics of a life in it. Nathan thought about what inheritance actually meant. Not the legal version, not the probate order version, the real version, the one that didn't require documentation. He thought about a woman who had laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, who had stood in a hallway after a conference and asked a man whether he actually believed half of what he'd just said. He thought about the stubbornness of that, the refusal to perform agreement, the insistence on saying the true thing even when the room expected otherwise. He thought about how he'd grown up carrying that quality without knowing where it came from, thinking it was just himself, thinking it was something he'd assembled from scratch out of necessity. He understood now that it was also hers, that she had given it to him without meaning to, just by being who she was, the way people gave the most important things, not through intention, but through the daily accumulated weight of showing up and being themselves in front of someone who was watching and learning. And he had given it to Lucy the same way. That was the line. That was the real inheritance. Not money, not voting rights, not a company or an estate or a name on a legal document, but this, the specific quality of a person that survived them and traveled forward through the people they'd been closest to, changing shape slightly with each generation, but recognizable at its core, the same stubbornness, the same insistence on looking at a thing until you understood it correctly, the same willingness to say no in the margins of ideas that deserve to be questioned. 4 generations of it now, counting Lucy. Probably more before that, in people Nathan would never know the names of. This was what people meant when they talked about legacy, he thought. Not the monuments, not the headstones that said he built with care. The actual thing, the living version, a 9-year-old on a hillside reaching for a stranger's hand because she had decided, through whatever calculus 9-year-olds use to make such determinations, that this person was worth the reaching. That was the thing that didn't die. That was the thing that got passed forward, whether you filed the paperwork or not. Hasset, he went back to the workshop on Monday. There was a partner's desk waiting for him. Early American, walnut, 2 pedestals, and a significant crack in the top surface that was going to require patience. He'd been looking forward to it. A crack like that, running with the grain, was usually repairable if you understood the wood, if you took the time to know which way it wanted to move and worked with that rather than against it. He put on coffee and opened the workshop doors to let in the December air and looked at the desk for a while before he touched it. He thought about the first morning he'd backed his truck through the iron service gate of the Hart estate, 40 minutes late with paint on his ear, running behind since 7:14 a.m. He thought about the library door and the particular quality of silence on the other side of it. He thought about a seized tambour and what was hiding behind it. Not just the box, not just the documents, but the version of his own history that had been waiting in the dark for 30 years for someone with the right instinct to look harder. Some things needed to be found before they could be understood. Some truths required the right person in the right place with the right willingness to keep going after the obvious answer. He had been, as it turned out, both the person looking and the thing being found. He thought there was probably something in that worth sitting with. He picked up his tools and got to work. The wood gave a little as the clamps took hold, the small specific give of something that had been held wrong for too long and was finally being allowed to settle correctly. Nathan listened to it, the way he'd learned to listen to old things, and made the small adjustments the material asked for, and let the morning light come in through the open doors and fall across the work the way it always had, the way it would tomorrow and the day after that. Outside, the December trees stood bare and patient against the sky. Everything that needed to be said had been said. Everything that needed to be recorded had been recorded. What was left now was just the work, the ordinary, daily, uncelebrated work of a life being lived correctly, one small, careful decision at a time. It was, Nathan thought, more than enough.